Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer, Chapter 7. Charlotte had barely fallen asleep when a whistle penetrated her dream, shrilling on and on. Though she shook her head and groaned to make it stop, she opened her eyes at last to find everything still dark. "Wake up, Claire," someone was saying. "Wake up at once!" The darkness hid all differences, so she could not tell at first where or when she was. "Wake up!" insisted the figure beside her bed, shaking her, prodding her with her voice. "Wake up, Claire!" it went on repeating, until gradually Charlotte began to realize that the name called was Claire, not Charlotte. "What's the time?" she asked sleepily. "What's the matter?" "Air raid alarm! Hurry up!" Nurse Gregory was brisk. "Quickly, find your dressing gown." Charlotte and Emily were sent into the passage now, only dimly lit, were swept into a tide of girls in dressing gowns, sleepily looking, their voices hushed, their slippers whispering on linoleum, with none of the daytime clatter and noise. It was hard to tell voices from feet as they slipped downstairs, among more passages to the gymnasium. They lined up in rows beneath the eyes of Miss Bite, who wore a dressing gown and had her hair in a thick braid down her back. The gym looked bleak, was meanly lit. The clustered ropes made shadows near the ceiling like huge upturned spiders, swaying a little now and then, though there seemed to be no wind below where Charlotte stood. Perhaps so many people breathing made them move, she thought, watching the shadow spiders, watching the two shadow stripes above the parallel bars bend and dart. One wall of the gym was more thickly striped by the wall bars and their shadows alternately. When the lights moved, so did they, and the wooden bars looked no more solid to the eye than the shadows behind them on the wall. It made an expectancy for her, a fear. The war had never frightened Charlotte much before, to her surprise, for she had thought you always would be frightened in a war, but it frightened her now. Would planes really come? Would bombs really fall on them? Nothing happened, though. Miss Bite read the registers class by class, the buzz of names and answers not echoing from the roof so much as disappearing slowly, melting like the sounds in a vaulted church. Charlotte was lulled by it, dazed and sleepy still. She felt she floated high above everyone. She did not remember whether to listen for Makepeace or Moby, so failed to answer any name till prodded by Emily when Moby had been called 3 times. Yes, Miss Bowser," she called confusedly and could not understand the giggles round. Would bombs really fall? Would they fall on her? She went on wondering, less and less urgently. Miss Bite closed the registers with a snap at last and announced, a false alarm after all, a practice only for the real thing, blowing a whistle herself for the all clear, to send them shuffling disconsolately, disappointedly even, back to bed. They were forbidden still to talk. But when no one was looking, Bunty crept up to Emily and hissed disgustedly what a cheat it was, how in a real raid they would have cocoa and biscuits, and stayed downstairs much longer, listening to stories and singing funny songs. "I wish it had been real," Emily said longingly afterwards, as she and Charlotte lay awake. "It sounds awful fun. Bunty saw a plane shot down once. She wasn't supposed to look out, but she did. It was a little like a red flame falling. I wish I could see one now. There weren't any air raids where Aunt Dolly lived." "I wouldn't want to," said Charlotte, for there would have been people inside the little red flame, and it might have fallen on them. "Oh, you're feeble, just like Claire. I don't suppose I'll see one now. Bunty's father says the war will end quite soon, she says." Later, she said sleepily, "Did Miss Bite look funny in a dressing gown, and with that silly braid like a little girl? Do you know her slipper fell off once, when she got down off the platform, and I saw her bare toes. I don't suppose there was so much different from anyone else's toes," said Charlotte, but Emily went on giggling till she fell asleep. In the morning, Charlotte still felt confused, and her head ached after the interrupted night. She sat for some time in the preparation class trying to sort out what work she had to do, but even then did not remember she had to learn a poem for Miss Bowser's poetry class on Monday morning. She had 2 detentions in the afternoon for an arithmetic exercise as well as the forgotten Latin exercise, and went to bed that night so tired she could scarcely speak, quite forgetting again to tell Claire about Samantha being her best friend. When she woke the next day, it was raining. The cedar tree gave gave rain a different special sound, a kind of hiss and bounce, which mingled with the other sounds, some soft, some clear, and its pouring, dripping, running. The drenched earth outside smelled clean and bold. Claire's diary was placed as usual between the Bible and the prayer book. Charlotte read then what she had been expecting to read for days, and did not know what she felt about it, whether she was pleased or sad. Miss Bite called me to see her. We're to move on Friday. The people are called Chisel Brown. Friday is my day here in 1918, so that is all right. Emily was still asleep. Charlotte felt extraordinarily fond of her. If the Mobys moved on Friday, and Emily was right about the bed being the reason for Claire and her changing about, she would see her only 2 days more, and then never, never again. A little while later, it occurred to her that even for Sunday she had been lying awake some considerable time. Surely the bell should be ringing soon. She prodded at Emily, who was beginning to wake of her own account, grunting, sighing, humping up the bedclothes. Emily, isn't it very late? Isn't it time for the bell? No, it isn't. Don't you remember we've an extra hour? Emily sounded extremely cross. Not living up to the softness Charlotte had been feeling toward her. How do you mean an extra hour? Oh, it's you. I thought it was Claire. Don't they do that with you anymore? Put the clocks on summertime and then back in the autumn? Oh, yes, but not yet. Well, they've done it here, and you've wakened me up for nothing. Bother you? You're beginning to wake up already. No, I wasn't. I was fast asleep. Charlotte let it go. She did not feel like an argument this morning. The next morning, Vanessa had to shake her awake, for she had had 1 hour's less sleep than usual, 2 hours less than the night before. All the rest of that week there continued this curious affair of nights longer and shorter than usual alternately, the effect quite as disconcerting as it would be suddenly to find yourself walking on legs of different length, or seeing with quite different-sighted eyes. Charlotte always seemed to be sleepy. She wished she could make up for the shorter nights by extra sleep on the longer nights, but never succeeded, lying awake instead each early morning for what seemed like hours, listening to Emily's even breathing and thinking thoughts about what might happen, which she would have preferred not to have time to think. After each shorter night, on the other hand, Vanessa or one of the other girls continued having to shake her out of sleep. Probably her sleepiness and consequent confusion were part of the reason why everything began to look impossibly wrong. Disaster seemed inevitable when Monday came. It was the morning of Miss Bowser's poetry class, and only 5 minutes before it was due to start, Charlotte realized that she had forgotten to learn a poem for it. There was no time now. She could only hope she would not be asked to recite. Unfortunately, Miss Bowser chose this day to test her new girls, just Charlotte and Susanna in their class. Susanna had her name called first and stood up, giggling, to recite Tennyson's Brook, each word in it given the same weight as the one before and the one after, each line plotted out in procession, sounding more like a wheel than water. That's enough, Sue. Well done, said Miss Bowser. Sit down now. She was quite different from the other headmistress, solemn, old-fashioned, remote Miss Bite. She was tall, smart, and stoutish, and wore pink-rimmed spectacles and pink lipstick and usually suits of tweed. She had a jolly smile, inviting confidence. Just because I'm headmistress, don't be afraid of me, it seemed to say. But neither she nor the headmistress. But because she was the headmistress, most people were afraid. Neither Janet nor Vanessa spoke in her classes, unless invited to, though they shouted it all the time in most other ones. Well now, Charlotte, she asked encouragingly, what have you got for us, eh? Charlotte climbed reluctantly to her feet. During Susanna's poem, she had remembered with relief Horatius at the bridge and repeated the verses over in her head. She began in a rush. Laws porcenta of Clusium. Give us the title first, please, said Miss Bowser. We all like to hear the title first, you know. Horatius at the bridge, began Charlotte again, less fast, but very loud. Louder, indeed, than she had meant, so she lowered her voice almost to a whisper for the first line of the poem. Lars porcenta of Clusium, by the 9 gods he swore. Miss Bowser was looking at her, still smiling. Charlotte gazed past at the blackboard. which had the date written on it beautifully in 2 colors. "That the great house of Tarquin," Miss Bowser broke in. "Do you have your book, Charlotte? The one I asked you to choose a poem from?" Charlotte nodded. It lay on her desk, a new anthology for the middle school. "Do you mind showing me your poem there?" Charlotte felt suddenly afraid. Taking the book, she searched with some hopefulness through the index of first lines, but there was no sign of Lars Porcenta of Clusium. Hurriedly, she turned to the index of titles, leafing pages over to find Horatius at the Bridge. There was no sign of that either. Miss Bowser watched her, smiling all the time, the smile trapped on her face now, not jolly anymore. She was touching her pink smile with her pink painted fingernails. Charlotte had begun to leaf through the book itself, hoping, still hoping, but more and more hopelessly. "Have you found it yet, Charlotte?" Miss Bowser inquired. No, I haven't," replied Charlotte, blushing and trembling. "That doesn't surprise me, dear," said Miss Bowser, "since it is not in the book." She paused impressively. She put both hands down on the teaching desk and leaned forward over them, angled like a figurehead of a ship, as hefty as stern. She was not smiling now. "I suppose, Charlotte, that was a poem you learned at your last school and were hoping to palm off on stupid Miss Bowser as this week's work?" This was so nearly true, if also miles off in a way Miss Bowser could never have guessed. But Charlotte had no defense. She stood miserably, almost in tears. Lifting one hand to push back her hair, feeling her face grow hotter and hotter. "I'm nothing like as stupid as that, you know, Charlotte, am I, girls?" "No, Miss Bowser," they chorused, all eyes on her, but creeping now and then slyly on Charlotte, with sympathy or enjoyment or disapproval. Miss Bowser took fire. She could take it evangelistically on almost anything, from moral standards to lost property or untidy cloakrooms, guiding her voice as skillfully as most people guide motor cars. "You have been very lazy, Charlotte. Very deceitful, very stupid. I don't like any of these things. I don't like the laziness of work not done. I don't like the deceit that tries to disguise such laziness. I don't like the stupidity you have shown, Charlotte, in trying to disguise both laziness and deceit. You are one of the oldest in this class, you know, and you have come to us with great reports, but now I hear only bad reports of you. Work forgotten, work slackly done. I hear you had no less than 2 detentions on Saturday, which for a new girl is a disgrace. What is more, I hear you are unfriendly, do not join in and take part with the other girls. That is something we do not like in this school. You let yourself down by this behavior, you know, Charlotte. You let your class down. You let me down. You let the school down. I think you'd better learn the poem on page 79 that begins, "When the British warrior queen bleeding from the Roman rods, since you seem to like the Romans. I'll hear you recite it tomorrow afternoon after lunch." Then Miss Bowser took her hands off the table and let her smile break out again. "Well, Charlotte, I think that's quite enough lecturing for now. Let's have no more trouble, eh? I like these classes to be a pleasant time for everyone. I don't like trouble any more than you know, eh, Charlotte?" "Yes, Miss Bite," observed Charlotte, head bowed over a new anthology for the middle school. "I think for a start you might get my name right, Charlotte," cried Miss Bowser, forgiving her with a jolly laugh. Everyone was subdued for the rest of the session, not just Charlotte. Afterwards, people crowded round, but though they were all sympathetic, then, later, upstairs, Charlotte heard Vanessa whispering to Janet how it wouldn't hurt goody Charlotte to be given a proper ticking off like that. She was so snooty and standoffish usually. That evening, Charlotte was lying on her bed, reading and trying not to think about what had happened in the morning, when all 3 of them came to her. Janet, Vanessa, and Elizabeth. They stood accusingly round the bed. "It's not kind," said Janet. "It's beastly," added Vanessa. "Look, you can't say you'll be someone's friend and then just not speak to them," put in Elizabeth indignantly. "Poor Susie's terribly upset," explained Janet. "I mean, if you don't want to be friends with her, you must tell her," said Elizabeth. "We don't mind if you don't speak to us," said Vanessa, "but you must talk to Susanna. You really must. It isn't fair not to talk to her, said Janet, now that she's your best friend. Charlotte had been too preoccupied lately to think much about Susanna, but she was overcome now with guiltiness, remembering that Susanna had looked unhappy and knowing that she kept on forgetting to tell Claire they were supposed to be such friends. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I'm sorry, she said. But before she or the others could say any more, Susanna herself appeared, rather red about the eyes, making Charlotte feel guiltier than ever, and setting the rest to give her meaning glances in place of words. That night, when the lights went out, Charlotte lay in bed trying not to cry because everyone, even Elizabeth, whom she liked, seemed to be against her now. Poor Claire, she thought, must be as confused and miserable, for it followed that they all would be against Claire as well. She was certain what she wanted now. All this confusion came from the double life they led. So she longed, quite certainly, for it to end. She longed for Friday or normality, and though she was sad when Thursday came because she would never see Emily again, it was a kind of numb, remote sadness that stayed outside, unsinking in her mind. Before they went to sleep that night, she asked Emily the question she would never have another chance to ask. Emily, are Claire and I, are we so very alike? Emily did not answer at once. If we're not, Charlotte said, I can understand why no one noticed that I'm not her and she's not me. It's funny, Emily said. I don't think you are alike, at least not in some ways. It's just that, well, you see, I just expected to see Claire, and so I thought it was, and of course you pretended you were Claire. I didn't pretend exactly. You kept on calling me Claire, and I didn't see how I could explain I wasn't. Then you did pretend, said Emily provokingly. You wouldn't have believed me if I had told you. Charlotte grew annoyed at her own surprise. To her own surprise, because she did not mean to feel annoyance. You didn't believe it for ages, even when you knew something funny was happening. Oh, I'm sorry, Emily. I didn't mean to quarrel, not tonight. I wasn't quarreling, said Emily. I didn't mean to say anything. I know it was just me really getting cross, said Charlotte apologetically. Emily said, I don't suppose I ever looked at you properly, or Claire. I mean, I knew her, too well. At least I thought I did. Perhaps that's why I never noticed you were different. Perhaps we never look at people properly, Charlotte thought. And she remembered looking in a mirror once and trying to draw herself, how, after she had been staring at her features for a little while, they seemed no longer to make her face or any face. They were just a collection of eyes, nose, and mouth. Perhaps if you stared at anyone like that, their face would disintegrate in the same way, till you could not tell whether you knew them or not, especially, of course, if there was no reason for them not to be who they said they were. And, she thought uncomfortably, what would happen if people did not recognize you? Would you know who you were yourself if tomorrow you started to call her Vanessa or Janet or Elizabeth? Would she know how to feel like Charlotte? Were you some particular person only because people recognized you as that? The next day felt strange, a kind of unwinding and relief. But though Charlotte was certain she would not go back in time again, she felt curiously flat as well as relieved, anxious, to grab at anything to remind herself of Emily and Claire. She was delighted when the school walk that afternoon set off in the direction of the church by the river, to which she had never been in her own time. For the school had had a chapel built since 1918, and all the Sunday services were now held there. She had liked the church with its plain round-topped windows and blue-starred ceiling, and found the thought of its continuity comforting today. Vanessa and Janet and Susanna were playing games that afternoon, and so Charlotte walked with Elizabeth, of whom she felt shy, especially after Monday's lecturing. Elizabeth had holes on both of her stockings and white marks on her skirt. When they came to the river, the island looked like a ship moored upon it, with golden trees growing around its decks. There was the little dock, too, just as Charlotte remembered it, with its barges and small squat crane. There was the church. She looked for it eagerly and found the shape ahead of them, but drawing nearer, she saw to her horror that it was no longer the whole roofed-in solid church, but walls and a few distorted beams. The doors had been boarded up, and willow herb and thistles grew round. She stopped abruptly to stare at it. Elizabeth stopped too, and so did the couple behind them. Charlotte said almost in tears,
"But I didn't know it was like this. I thought..."
"What did you think?" asked Elizabeth. They had begun to walk again, slowly lagging behind the rest.
"It had a roof. I mean, it was a proper church, not like this."
The bricks were blackened where the roof had been. There was jagged blackened glass around the edges of the windows. On some, the frames were still more or less complete.
"But it's been burned down for years," Elizabeth said. "Oh, for ages, I think. But I saw a roof," cried Charlotte. "It was all blue with little gold stars on it."
She did not think about betraying herself, and briefly, she did not care. After all, it did not much matter now.
"But you couldn't have seen a roof," Elizabeth was saying hotly. "It must have been burned long before you were born. So you couldn't have seen it, could you? Not possibly, not unless you'd been alive before."
Elizabeth was joking, Charlotte thought. She could not have meant that seriously, yet it gave her the chance to tell, and suddenly she wanted to, but she could not frame the words. Suppose Elizabeth did not believe her. She might think Charlotte had gone quite mad. So she quickly lost the courage for it, and said lamely,
"Someone must have told me. About the gold stars, I mean. Or perhaps I dreamed it. I don't know."
Elizabeth said, She stared at Charlotte then intently, while Charlotte went on pretending not to know. She stared, looking straight ahead of her, though she was beyond thinking of something nonchalant to say.
"I can't make you out. Look, why are you so strange? Why do you say such odd, peculiar things? As if you never listened, never noticed anything that went on. Honestly, I wonder about you sometimes."
She stopped staring at Charlotte, fiddled with her untidy hair, making it untidier, pulled her skirt round, and tried to rub the white marks off it with a wetted finger.
"There is something, isn't there? Something odd. Look, why don't you tell? I wouldn't tell anyone else. I promise. If you told, honestly, I wouldn't. Look, honestly."
Charlotte, stunned by now, shook her head, still not looking at Elizabeth, who would have argued more, but to Charlotte's great relief, the prefect in charge called out, and, walking back to hurry them, became involved in some other argument with Elizabeth that they carried on all the way home. Between Charlotte and Elizabeth, nothing more was said, though Charlotte thought a great deal. The church still upset her considerably. She found she did not want to talk about it to Elizabeth any more. That evening in their room they had a pillow fight, started by Elizabeth. All of them joined in, even Charlotte, free of Claire. Of solemn Claire, but still tentative, being out of practice at fooling around. Susanna was excited, jumping up and down, yelling for the pillow to be thrown at her, missing it usually if it were thrown, and giggling almost too much to throw it back. Elizabeth swung alive in her sudden, astonishing way, pretended to dance with pillows or box with them, throwing wildly with Indian calls, knocking ornaments and photographs off the chest of drawers. Janet and Vanessa, on the other hand, threw with as careful, deadly accuracy as if they were playing school games. In the middle of the fight, the door opened, and Sarah walked in to lecture them coldly. Charlotte, like the rest, without a sign of friendliness, which hurt Charlotte a little. But as Sarah went out of the room again, she had a sudden wild, extraordinary idea about her, nor could she imagine why she had never thought of such a thing before.
"Elizabeth," she asked. "Elizabeth, what's her name?" "Sarah, of course, idiot." "No, silly, her surname, I mean."
Elizabeth was reading again and did not answer at once. Charlotte almost brought an answer out herself and had the name ready on her lips.
"Moby it was, for that name would explain everything." "Reynolds," said Elizabeth. "Her name is Reynolds. Didn't you know?"
Charlotte had known, of course, had just lost the name temporarily. Had it been Moby, she would have noticed it at once on school lists. She realized, as she had noticed Reynolds, though the name Reynolds meant nothing to her. 5 minutes before, she had not been excited or expectant at all. But now she felt as hugely disappointed as if she had waited a week for Elizabeth's answer, expecting to find out from why Sarah's mother had known her name, and even a little about Emily, or Claire grown up. When she thought about it, Charlotte half dreaded the ordinariness of walking next to Susanna for the second day running. She found herself still dreading it the next morning as she swam up out of sleep, so lay for a moment with closed eyes, the sunshine rosy on her lids, until suddenly she realized there should be no sun, and felt, after all, a kind of wild hope. Perhaps she and Claire would continue to change after all on alternate days, lodgings or no lodgings. But when she opened her eyes, she saw the cedar tree as before, and the 1918 school bedroom. She started up abruptly. Emily lay beside her, but at Charlotte's movements, she too awoke and sat up, blinking, gazing at Charlotte, first with bewilderment, and then increasingly with horror. "But I thought," Charlotte said, "I thought—" Emily spoke in a small, flat voice. "We didn't go into lodgings yesterday after all. We're going today." And that is the end of chapter 7.